Hybridity in Hispanic America, the cultural effects of colonization. This presentation will analyze the culture of those living in the countries of Mexico and Texas through the post-colonial theory of hybridity. Examples or representations of how this cultural hybridity has evolved over the course of their history as a result of colonialism can be found in the changing nature of their religion, society, politics, traditions, bloodlines, and architecture. Though a concept which has existed for centuries, hybridity takes on a new dimension when applied to the interactions that took place between colonists and the colonized. Hispanic, a title which can be bestowed upon anybody from Spain or Spanish-speaking countries. Referred to in its most basic form as a mixing of elements from more than one culture, the prolonged forced cohabitation of a country's native population with that of a people who hold different values and practices will almost inevitably result in a certain level of cultural intermingling. As can be seen in this diagram, characteristics of culture A and culture B can be combined to form a third culture, right in the middle, which is known as the hybrid culture. Culture cannot be defined in and of itself, but rather must be seen within the context of its construction. Halsey's diagram conceptualizing hybridity, page 32. Although Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage marked the first landmark European discovery of the Americas, it was not until 1519 that Mexico, then referred to as New Spain, was initially explored through an expedition led by Conquistador Hernán Cortés. Situated at the bottom end of North America, by the time the Spanish arrived, the Aztec Empire had been the principal culture since 1325, the current emperor called Montezuma, who ruled from the Mexican capital city then called Tenochtitlan. However, contrary to Spanish expectations, in many aspects, most notably their military, architecture, astronomy, and government and taxation systems, the Aztecs were already sophisticated, progressive, and orderly, with advanced agriculture, sophisticated building techniques, and knowledge of gold and other precious metals. Richard Middleton, Colonial America, A History, 3rd edition, page 6. Nevertheless, as depicted by the pictures in this slide, the contrast between the two central cultures in Mexico at this time, Spanish on the left and Aztec on the right, is very evident. Cortés represents what was perceived by the Spanish at the time as being the more sophisticated and cultured society, while Montezuma is portrayed as being much coarser and more unrefined. Wealth and confidence in their individual purposes, however, are clearly expressed in both these pictures. It is only the physical manifestations of these traits that is the difference between these two men, a difference which colonization mostly succeeded in breaching, Spanish culture becoming primarily dominant. After achieving triumph over Emperor Montezuma and destroying most of the rest of the Aztec race, Spanish then turned their attention towards converting what was left of the native culture, of which there were numerous variations stretched across the different regions. Staunch Roman Catholics, Spanish efforts to convert the indigenous population, primarily through missions, was established as a means by which to uphold their Christian duty, as well as establish hegemony or control of the area at the same time. In 1519, Alonso Alvarez de Pineda was the first to travel along the Texas coastline, 1689 marking the intended re-establishment of complete Spanish control over the region by Alonso de Leon. A mission by the banks of the San Antonio River was built, which is represented in this picture, around which a town was also formed in 1718, in order to further cement Spanish culture and prevent any more encroachment of foreign influences, particularly the French. As seen in this map, the amount of land claimed by the French by the 1700s in North America greatly surpassed that of Spain. The impact the presence of these missionaries had in both Texas and Mexico was that native cultures and understandings of divinity mixed with strict Catholic teachings to create a hybrid religion that incorporated native religion into a larger frame of Catholicism. Spanish colonization, Smoot University, Inc. So while the majority of the population in Texas and Mexico continue to identify themselves as Roman Catholics to this day, there are also many religious Aztec traditions that are still celebrated, such as the Day of the Dead. This is just one demonstration of the impact these two cultures had on one another. Another significant impact colonization had upon the hybridity of Mexico and Texas came in the form of the 6 different racial profiles which were developed. The more advanced American colonies of Spain having the special distinction of evolving into mixed settlements in comparison with many other colonizers, such as Britain and France, who were more apt to place emphasis on subjugation of the native population than assimilation. Quite a few aspects which were a part of Aztec culture were actually allowed to be kept alive, and were even embraced by the Spanish, when it suited them, such as the evolution of chocolate. Primarily dominated by a mestizo, those of mixed native and Spanish blood, and Creole, Spaniards who were born in Hispanic American minority, and centered upon an Amerindian, the indigenous population of New Spain, working force. Mexico was one of the first examples of these communities where white settlers created societies as similar to that of Old Spain as alien conditions allowed, controlling and as far as possible absorbing the indigenous population. T.K. Fieldhouse, The Colonial Empires, page 11. One primary objective of Spanish settlers in Mexico was to create homes similar to that of the landed estates of Castilian nobility. The realization of this desire then led to the attempted establishment of a social structure resembling that which existed in Spain, the duty of the colonial power to assimilate them to European religion and civilization. T.K. Fieldhouse, page 22. Because the natural environment was already appropriate for agriculture and stock raising, the indigenous population were pastoral and sedentary, making for an ideal inferior peasantry whom the Spanish could exploit to work for them in the fields. Driven by their other primary desire to accumulate as much wealth as possible, the Spanish also put the Amerindians to work as forced labor in their many silver and gold mines. Although the Amerindians, mestizos, and Creoles were officially accepted as equals in status to the Criollo, or pure Spanish settlers, in practice this was not what usually occurred, the basis around which social classes in Spain were separated differing from that of the Amerindians. While the Aztecs placed a special emphasis on warriors and the priesthood, Spaniards were more concerned with lineage and the purity of one's bloodlines as markers of distinction in defining one's identity and thus their place in society and role in the governing of the country. Therefore, mestizos, products of the many intermarriages which occurred, were allowed virtually no input into how Mexico was governed, and although Creoles were involved, it was still in a very limited capacity due to their mixed bloodlines. In conjunction with these, there were also numerous Tijanos, Spanish for Texan, in Texas, who held both Spanish and American heritage. Mestizaje is an overarching ideology which serves to encompass the great ethnic and cultural amalgamation created, not just by Spaniards and native people, but by generations of immigration and social interaction in Spanish America. Dana Libson and Barbara Mundy, Surveying Mestizaje. Exposure to European diseases the natives had absolutely no immunity against, combined with the unsafe and unhealthy conditions in the mines and fields they worked in, meant that the Amerindian population dwindled dramatically, from 25 million to 1 million between the years of 1503 and 1660. Therefore, between 200,000 to 500,000 Africans were imported for over 2 decades by the Spanish in order to supplement the workforce, an action which soon resulted in the birth of many in the last racial profile I have to mention, mulattoes, those of mixed African and Spanish or Aztec blood. Proving to have an impact upon the nature of Mexican culture through the contribution of an African influence in such areas as music and dance, they also helped to shape Mexican history. This picture of Vicente Guerrero, a mulatto who became president of Mexico and also had a state named after him. Today, there are primarily large concentrations of them only in certain areas of Mexico, such as Costa Chica and Veracruz. All 6 of the racial profiles I have mentioned, Mestizo, Creole, Amerindian, Criollo, Tijano, and Mulatto, are prime examples of the racial hybridity that is so prevalent in these regions, which had the effect of contributing tremendously to the ever-evolving sense of identity present in both Mexico and Texas. These racial titles over time became more of an indication of one's status in society, however, than their actual bloodlines, so that by the end of the 1700s, a Texas San Antonio Spaniard became anybody with European features, relatively white skin, or economic or military status regardless of physical appearance. Gerald Pollo Gilberto Hinojosa, Tijano Origins in 18th Century San Antonio, page 47. Mestizos occupying the largest section of the population today. In order to maintain both their trade links and the dominance over these racially hybrid colonies, the Spanish monarchy instigated the same bureaucratic administration to that which was used in maintaining the other kingdoms and provinces. Giving rise to a rather autocratic method of governing, the first institution to be put in place was the Casa de Contratación, House of Trade, which lasted from 1503 until 1790. However, it was the Council of the Indies from 1524 to 1834 that became the main forum through which all colonial matters were managed. They operated under a top-down structural approach that can be juxtaposed with the previous Aztec government system, which was slightly similar but much less complex. Based around the family or individual at the very bottom, they moved up, the Calpulli being the ones who took care of the organizational and land matters, Above them, the executive or city council, who served the Tlatkani or emperor as his advisors. The Spanish government, on the other hand, was ruled by the supreme authority of the King of France within the metropolitan government, directly beneath which were the viceroys, his representatives in the colonies, and the colonial government, who included the Governor-General of New France, the Intendant, and the Superior Council, all of whom were influenced by the Catholic government of Rome, and were in charge of the civil and judiciary administration of the colonies. Now, the effectiveness of these measures and offices were lessened by corruption and the distance between Spain and the Americas. Tax and trade were another two principal ways through which the Spanish attempted to gain as much profit as they could out of Mexico, as well as preserve their own authority. In line with this, tight restrictions were placed over trade with other countries. Over the years, these restrictions, along with many other factors, caused dissatisfaction towards Spanish rule, which, along with the deterioration of Spain as a world power, grew increasingly worse, making way for the start of the Mexican War of Independence in 1810, which lasted until 1821, when they succeeded in achieving independence. Now officially recognized as a federal republic known as the United Mexican States, this victory opened up the way for greater interaction with the also newly independent United States just across the border. No longer officially classified into separate racial profiles, such as Spanish, Amerindian, or Mulatto, they could now all instead be referred to as Mexicans, in theory. Cultures are not stagnant concepts, however, which can be defined without comparison to other cultures. The areas people rely upon to define where their culture originated diasporic, with modelled points of entry at various points in time. Hazlitt's Dyer, page 35. This can be seen very clearly in the current cultures of those living in Mexico, but more particularly Texas, which has been shaped by a myriad of different influences outside Spain and Africa due to conflicts which arose between the now independent Mexico and the democratic US over land borders that escalated into the Mexican-American War, which lasted from 1846 to 48. This map showing very clearly the disputed area, which was of course Texas. Sparked by the US's annexation of Texas in 1845 after they became a republic in 1836. The end of this war resulted in Mexico also losing the colonies of California and New Mexico, as well as a major shift in the boundaries dividing Mexico and America. The extent of the change in borderlines can be seen when comparing this map, where Texas is still very much a part of New Spain, with this one, which shows the many territorial gains made by the US in the early to middle 1800s, Nevada, Utah, and Arizona, also being succeeded by Mexico. The two races, the American distinctively so called, and the Spanish Americans or Mexicans, are now brought by the war into inseparable contact. No treaties can henceforth dissever them. Dr. Ashbel Smith, former Secretary of State, Texas Republic, 1848, referenced in Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas, page 14. According to historian Salvador D. Madariaga, the natural progression of Hispanic American indigenous history and culture was combined inextricably with that of an utterly alien lineage of men, and in the process caused them a psychological shock of incalculable gravity. The Rise of the Spanish American Empire, 1947, in D.K. Fieldhouse, page 24. Spanish colonization is responsible for the introduction of the many traditions, concepts, flora, fauna, food, and clothing, which have since become an intrinsic part of both Mexican and Texan cultures. Some examples include cows, muskets or guns, tomatoes, goats, the rodeo, bread, vaqueros or cowboys, and of course their horses. The Spanish also lent the distinctive flavor to the names of many different towns, such as El Paso in Texas, Los Angeles in California, and Veracruz in Mexico. The impact wrought by both Spaniards and other foreign influences can clearly be seen as well in the visual side of their culture, especially through such mediums as architecture. The main form of buildings in Aztec society were limited to temples and adobe huts, such as this one. It was only after Spanish settlement that missions, presidios, military barracks, and pueblos or civic towns were introduced. Along with these came new styles of architecture that represented the changing cultural dynamic of these two countries, the most prominent Baroque, elements of which can be seen in this picture of a Spanish colonial style house. But also the hacienda, this picture an example, its most distinguishing feature the wide open courtyard. Language is yet another major form through which the influence of colonization can be seen in Mexico and Texas. The prime native language of the Aztecs, Nahuatl, in taking ownership of the language, changing the way that it is used. The boundaries of language as belonging to a specific place or race are dissolved. Haj's Daya, page 34. Although Spanish is accepted as the official national language today, it's a different dialect to what is spoken in Spain, and coexists with English, as well as many of the native tongues which managed to survive, the two most prominent Nahuatl and Mayan. This picture showcasing a few examples of words in the Nahuatl language, above which are their symbols. Hybridity challenges notions of identities and cultures as fixed, stable, or bounded entities, emphasizing the interactions and exchanges that take place and have taken place across cultures. Stephanie Corley, Hybridity. The contact between the Amerindians, the Spanish, Africans, and Americans, which primarily occurred thanks to the catalyst of colonization, helped to produce a unique culture in two separate but side-by-side countries, brimming with hybridity, a concept that is a major influencing factor in the shaping and continued evolution of their identities as individual people and as countries. Now on to references. The first slide, holding all of the URLs belonging to the many pictures I've included in my presentation, which I hope you enjoyed. This second slide lists numerous books which were of particular help. The first two ones I relied upon the most when researching the history of Mexico in particular, but also Texas. The first, D.K. Fieldhouse, writing The Colonial Empires, a comparative survey from the 18th century, 1966, while Richard Middleton was the author of Colonial America, a History, 1565 to 1776, 2003. The third was a PDF document written by Haj's Daya, entitled Conceptualizing Hybridity, Deconstructing Boundaries of the Hybrid. This was the one that was the most help to me in explaining the concept of hybridity in a way I actually understood. And the last two, Roger Bigelow Merriman, writing The Rise of the Spanish Empire in the Old World and in the New, Volume 3, The Emperor, and Lloyd C. Gardner, along with William Linnell, authoring Looking Backward, A Reintroduction to American History, 1974. These two just allowed me to fill in some blanks about the Aztecs, and especially their first introduction to the Spanish. This last slide holds all of the resources I utilized from the internet in order to find information on other points of interest in my presentation, such as the African presence in Mexico and Texas, the Mexican-American War, Mexican War of Independence, mestizaje ideology, and most importantly, the different traditions which were melted together across cultures in order to form the two accepted today as distinctively Mexican and Texan. Thank you for listening.